There are 6 people in this video. 5 of them died from the job they did. The 6th one survived something nobody is supposed to survive, and he still does that job today. 5 of these professions no longer exist on Earth because of what happened to the people you are about to meet. One of them is still hiring this morning. My name is Blackwell. I have spent the last several years inside court records, hospital admissions, parliamentary transcripts, and union archives looking for the bodies that paid for every safety rule we on the corner of East Superior Street and started her first day. The job paid better than anything else a young woman could find in Ottawa. 8 cents a dial. 250 dials a day if your hands were fast. The dials were small, round, and beautiful. They were the faces of wristwatches and pocket watches and aircraft instruments. The numbers had to glow in the dark. To make the numbers glow, the company mixed radium powder into a special paint. Radium was new then. Radium was magic. Newspapers called it a wonder element. Department stores sold radium toothpaste, radium face cream, radium drinking water for vitality. Wealthy men in New York bought tonics laced with it. Doctors prescribed it for arthritis. Nobody in 1922 in Ottawa, Illinois, told Catherine that the soft, warm glow on her brush was tearing apart the cells of her body. The brushes were tiny, camel hair. The bristles spread out after a few strokes, and a fuzzy brush ruined the fine numbers. So the supervisors taught the girls a technique: lip, dip, paint. You put the brush between your lips, you twirled it to a sharp point, you dipped it in the radium paint, and you painted. Lip, dip, paint. 250 times a day. Catherine did this for 9 years. The other girls in the studio were her friends: Charlotte Purcell, Marie Rossiter, Pearl Payne, Frances Glasinski. They ate lunch together. They walked home together. On Friday nights, they sometimes painted radium on their teeth and on their fingernails as a joke to scare their boyfriends in the dark. They painted it on their dresses to glow on the dance floor. They went home covered in luminous dust. Their mothers said their daughters glowed when they came up the stairs at night. In 1925, the first girl died. Her name was Amelia Maggia. She had worked at a different radium plant in Orange, New Jersey. Her jaw had crumbled in the dentist's hands. He pulled what he thought was a loose tooth, and a piece of her lower jawbone came out with it. Then another piece, then another. By the time she died, her dentist had removed most of her mandible in fragments, by hand, without anesthetic, because there was nothing left to numb. The death certificate said syphilis. Her family knew it was not syphilis. Catherine Donohue did not know about Amelia Maggia in 1925. The Radium Dial Company knew. The owners had read the medical reports. They had seen the warning from the United States Radium Corporation in New Jersey. They had been told, in writing, that lip-pointing the brushes was killing the women. They posted no notice. They changed no procedure. They kept selling watches. Catherine got married in 1932 to a man named Thomas Donohue. She had 2 children, a daughter named Mary Jane, a son named Tommy. In 1934, when she was 31 years old, her left hip began to ache. The pain was deep. It was not muscle pain. It was inside the bone. She limped. She tried to hide it from her husband. By 1935, the limp was a stagger. By 1936, her hip socket was disintegrating, and a tooth fell out of her mouth at the breakfast table while she was buttering bread for her son. She went to Dr. Charles Loeffler in Chicago. He took an X-ray. Her bones were honeycombed. The radium had migrated into her skeleton because radium chemically resembles calcium, and the human body, given a choice, will pull either one into the bone matrix without knowing the difference. Once it was in her bones, it never left. It just kept emitting alpha particles, every second, every minute, every hour, for the rest of her life, and long after. Dr. Loeffler weighed her. She weighed 71 pounds. She had been 125. She kept her teeth in a small glass jar by her bed. When pieces of her jaw broke off, she added them to the jar. By 1938, the jar held fragments of bone. She kept it because she said someday someone would need to see it. In July of 1938, the trial began. Catherine could not walk. They carried her into the hearing room on a wicker chair. She weighed 68 pounds. Her jaw was wrapped in white gauze because she could not stop bleeding from the ulcers where her teeth had been. The Radium Dial Company sent lawyers in dark suits. The lawyers argued that she could not prove the radium had caused her illness. The lawyers argued that she had waited too long to file. The lawyers argued that her contract had released the company from liability. Catherine testified from the chair. Her voice was so quiet that the stenographer asked her to repeat almost every answer. She held up the small glass jar with the pieces of her jawbone in it. She said, "This is what they did to me." She said, "I came to work for them when I was 19 years old." She said, "They knew. They always knew." The hearing officer ruled in her favor on July 23rd. The Radium Dial Company appealed. The appeals lost, one after another, all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court. The final verdict came down on July 24th. Catherine Donohue had won. She had won the right to compensation. She had won the precedent that would protect every worker after her. She died on July 27th, 1938, 4 days after the final verdict. She was 35 years old. Her son Tommy was 4. Her daughter Mary Jane was 6. When the undertakers prepared her body, they reported something they had never seen before. In the dark of the funeral parlor, late at night, with the lights off, Catherine Donohue glowed. A soft, steady, greenish light came from her bones through her skin. The radium that had killed her was still working. It would still be working 1,000 years from now. It is still working today in the cemetery in Ottawa, Illinois, where she is buried under a small headstone that does not mention the case, the trial, or the verdict. The Radium Dial Company closed in 1936, 2 years before the verdict. The owners never paid the full settlement. They had moved their assets to a different corporate name. Catherine's family received pennies on the dollar. But every radiation safety law passed in the United States in the next half-century, every dosimeter clipped to a hospital worker's collar, every yellow trefoil sign on a laboratory door, every regulation that limits the dose a worker can absorb, every one of those laws traces a thread back to Catherine Wolfe Donohue and the small glass jar of bone. 5 girls from her shop testified at her trial. Within 3 years, 4 of them were dead. The 5th, Charlotte Purcell, lived to be 74. She had lost her left arm to amputation. She told a reporter near the end of her life that on rainy nights, the stump where her arm had been still glowed. His hands shook so badly he could not hold a teacup, and he was 34 years old. His name was Charles Stewart. He worked in a hat factory in Danbury, Connecticut. In 1898, Danbury was the hat capital of America. 5,000 men worked the felting trade in a town of less than 20,000 people. They made the felt hats that gentlemen wore on Wall Street, and the bowlers that beat cops wore on the New York streets, and the silk-finished derbies that were buried with presidents. The men who made those hats almost never wore them. They could not afford them. They could barely afford to live. Charles was born in 1864, the son of an Irish dockworker who had come to Connecticut after the famine. He started in the felting room when he was 17. The felting room was where the rabbit fur and the beaver fur were turned into the dense, smooth fabric of a felt hat. To turn loose fur into felt, the workers had to brush the fur with a solution. The solution was called the carrot. The carrot was a thick, orange-brown liquid, and its active ingredient was mercuric nitrate. Mercury, in solution, made the fur fibers shrink and lock together into felt. Without mercury, you could not make a proper bowler hat in the 1890s. With mercury, you could not keep your nervous system. The felting rooms had no ventilation. The workers brushed the carrot onto the fur with bare hands in closed rooms, breathing the vapor for 10 and 11 and 12 hours a day. The vapor was invisible. It did not smell. It did not sting the eyes. It just settled, slowly, into the soft tissue of the lungs, and from there into the blood, and from there into the brain. Charles started shaking when he was 26. It was a small thing at first, a tremor in his right hand when he was tired. He thought it was nothing. By 28, it was both hands. By 30, his head shook. He could not eat soup. He could not sign his own name. The other men in the factory had a phrase for it. They called it the Danbury Shakes. Almost everyone got it eventually. Some of them got it at 30, some of them not until 50. Almost nobody worked the trade for 30 years without getting it. It was simply what the job did. The shakes were only the beginning. The shakes were only the beginning. Mercury attacks the central nervous system in stages. First the tremor, then the slurred speech, then what the medical literature of the time called erethism, which was a clinical word for what the wives called the changes. The man who had been quiet became angry. The man who had been gentle became suspicious. Charles Stewart began to believe his neighbors were stealing from him. He believed his wife was poisoning his food. He believed his children were laughing at him behind his back. He sat at the kitchen table at night with a kerosene lamp burning, watching the door, because he was sure someone was coming for him. Nobody was coming. The mercury was inside his brain. His wife was a woman named Bridget. She had married Charles when she was 22 and he was 26, before the shakes started, before the changes. She had 2 children with him, a boy named Patrick and a girl named Annie. She watched her husband disappear into a stranger over the course of 7 years. There are letters she wrote to her sister in Boston that have survived in the Connecticut State Library. She wrote, "He is not the man I married. He is somebody else now, wearing his face." She wrote, "He cries in the bathroom and does not know I can hear him." She wrote, "The doctor says it is the work, but the work pays for the rent, so what are we to do?" In 1901, Charles Stewart could not work anymore. His hands shook so badly he could not hold a hat block, could not press the felt, could not collect his pay envelope without dropping it on the floor. He was 36 years old. The factory laid him off without a pension and without severance. The factory kept making hats. There were always more men coming up from the docks who needed the job. Charles died in November of 1901. The official cause was listed as nervous exhaustion. The autopsy was performed at Danbury Hospital by a doctor named Halsey, who had been studying the felting trade for some years. Halsey opened the skull and found a brain that had shrunk inside it. He took tissue samples. He sent them to a laboratory in New Haven. The laboratory reported elevated levels of mercury in the cerebellum, the hippocampus, and the frontal cortex. Halsey wrote in his report that this was the 73rd such autopsy he had performed on a Danbury hat worker in 12 years, and that the findings were always the same. He wrote, "The men twitch like puppets on broken strings." He wrote, "The trade is killing them." He recommended legislation. There was no legislation in 1901. The state of Connecticut held hearings in 1904. The factory owners testified that mercury was essential to the trade and that there was no substitute. The hearings produced a report. The report recommended ventilation. The factory owners installed nothing. The men kept dying. In 1921, the Public Health Service of the United States published a major study confirming that 80% of Danbury hat workers showed measurable signs of mercury poisoning. Nothing was done. In 1941, with the country at war and mercury needed for munitions, the federal government finally banned mercuric nitrate in American hat making by executive order. The reason was not the workers. The reason was the war. The mercury was needed for bombs. 40 years too late for Charles Stewart. 40 years too late for Bridget. 40 years too late for the 73 men in Dr. Halsey's reports and the thousands more whose names were never written down. The expression "mad as a hatter," which had been an English idiom since the 1840s, became American slang in the 1920s. By the time a child reading Alice in Wonderland in 1965 laughed at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, the men who had inspired the joke had been dead for half a century, and the felt hat trade was almost extinct. Modern hats, the few that are still made, use synthetic chemicals. Nobody loses their mind for a bowler anymore. In Danbury today, there is a small museum. It contains hat blocks, brushes, and a collection of finished hats from the 1890s. There is one display case in the back that nobody photographs. The case contains a single felting brush, dark with old residue, and a card that reads, "This brush was used between 1894 and 1901. The man who held it died in November of 1901 of mercury poisoning. His name was Charles Stewart. He was 37 years old." Her jaw began to glow green in the dark, and then it began to rot off her face. Her name was Sarah Chapman. She was 19 years old. She worked at the Bryant and May Match Factory at Fairfield Road in Bow, East London, in 1888. The factory employed 1,400 women and girls, mostly Irish, mostly under 20, mostly working 12-hour shifts for less than 5 shillings a week. The factory made matches. The matches were tipped with white phosphorus. White phosphorus is a chemical that ignites at low temperatures, produces a soft glow in the dark, and slowly destroys the human jawbone of anyone who inhales its fumes for years on end. Sarah had started at the factory when she was 13. Her father was a dock laborer. Her mother took in laundry. There were 6 children at home in a 2-room flat in Bow, and Sarah's wages were not extra. They were rent. She walked to the factory at 6 in the morning and walked home at 8 at night. And on Saturdays, she walked there at 6 in the morning and walked home at 4 in the afternoon. And on Sundays, the factory was closed. That was her week. She did this for 6 years. The job was called dipping. The wooden matchsticks came down a conveyor in racks of 1,000. Sarah dipped each rack into a vat of melted white phosphorus paste. The paste hardened on the tip of the match. The match was sold to a household in Manchester or Liverpool or Glasgow for a halfpenny a box. Sarah dipped 200 racks a day, 200,000 match heads. She breathed the phosphorus vapor for 12 hours. She ate her bread lunch with phosphorus on her hands. The other girls said you knew you had been dipping when your fingernails glowed faintly when you turned out the gas lamp at night. The disease was called phossy jaw. The medical name was phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. It started with a toothache. The tooth would ache for weeks, then crack, then fall out. The socket would refuse to heal. The bone underneath would begin to die. The dead bone would push up through the gum, gray and rotten, and the jaw would become so infected that the breath of the sufferer could be smelled across a room. In the dark, the dying jawbone glowed a dim green white, the same soft glow as the matches themselves. By the late stages, sufferers were eating through tubes because they could not chew. The infection often reached the brain. The mortality rate, once phossy jaw was diagnosed, was approximately 1 in 4. The treatment, when it was tried, was the surgical removal of the entire lower jaw. Most women refused. Sarah did not have phossy jaw in 1888. She was lucky. But her co-worker, Cornelia Hanbury, had it. Her co-worker, Mary Driscoll, had it. Her co-worker, Eliza Martin, was buried that summer, age 23, after the disease had eaten through her jaw and into her skull. Sarah went to Eliza's funeral in a borrowed black dress. She came back to the factory the next morning. She kept dipping. There was no choice. In June of 1888, a woman named Annie Besant came to the factory gates. Besant was a journalist and a socialist agitator. She had heard rumors of the conditions inside Bryant and May. She interviewed several of the matchwomen during their lunch break, including Sarah Chapman. She published an article in her newspaper, The Link, on June 23rd, titled "White Slavery in London." The article named the factory. The article named the wages. The article named the disease. The article named individual workers, including Sarah, who had spoken on the record. The factory owners read the article. The factory owners called the matchwomen into the office one by one and demanded each of them sign a paper saying that Annie Besant had lied. Sarah Chapman refused to sign. 3 of her co-workers refused to sign. The owners fired the 3 co-workers on the spot. Sarah looked around the dipping room. She looked at the racks of matches. She looked at Cornelia Hanbury, whose jaw was already beginning to swell. She put down her brush, took off her apron, and walked out the factory gate. She told the women near her to follow her. By the end of that afternoon, 1,400 women had walked off the job. The strike lasted 3 weeks. The matchwomen had no union, no strike fund, no support. They had only each other and the press, which Annie Besant kept hammering with new articles every day. They marched to Parliament. A delegation of 56 women, with Sarah Chapman among them, met with members of the House of Commons inside the building itself. It was the first time in British history that a group of working-class women had spoken to Parliament about their own labor conditions. Sarah was 19. She wore the same borrowed black dress she had worn to Eliza Martin's funeral. She showed the members of Parliament her hands. The factory owners broke. Bryant and May agreed to all the strikers' demands. Wages went up. The fines that had been deducted from pay for talking, for dropping a match, for going to the toilet too often, were abolished. A separate, ventilated room was built for eating lunch, away from the phosphorus. Sarah and the fired women were rehired. The strike ended on July 16, 1888. The strike did not end Phossyjaw. White phosphorus matches continued to be manufactured in Britain for another 20 years. Bryant and May did not switch to safer red phosphorus until 1901, and the international ban on white phosphorus matches did not pass until the Berne Convention of 1906, which Britain ratified in 1908. Between Sarah Chapman's strike and the final ban, an estimated 4,000 more matchwomen across Europe died of Phossyjaw. Sarah Chapman lived to be 83. She married a cabinet maker named Charles Henry Dearman in 1891. She had 6 children. She kept her teeth. She kept her jaw. She lived to see the matches she had once dipped become illegal. She lived to see the union she had helped create become the largest women's union in Britain. She died in 1945 and was buried in a public grave in Manor Park Cemetery in East London, the grave unmarked, the location forgotten for almost 70 years. In 2022, her great-great-granddaughter, a schoolteacher named Sam Johnson, located the grave through cemetery records and ran a campaign to put a headstone on it. The headstone was installed in 2023. It reads, Sarah Chapman, matchwoman, striker. She was the first one to walk out the gate. She survived the disease that defined her industry. Her victory came not from the fact that she was strong, but from the fact that she refused to be silent. Every women's labor right in modern Britain, every maternity protection, every equal pay law, every harassment regulation, runs on a thread that begins with 1,400 women in soot-stained aprons walking out of a factory in Bow on a hot July afternoon, led by a 19-year-old who would not sign a piece of paper. He was 12 years old. He climbed into the chimney. He never came out alive. His name was George Brewster. The date was February 12, 1875. The chimney was at Fulbourn Hospital, a mental asylum on the outskirts of Cambridge, England. The chimney was 30 feet tall, and at one point in its length, it narrowed to a flue only 9 inches across. George Brewster weighed 48 pounds. His master, William Wire, had selected him for this job because he was small enough to fit. George had been sold by his parents at the age of 8. The transaction was legal. It was called apprenticeship. His parents, who lived in a workhouse in Cambridgeshire, had received 7 shillings from William Wire in 1871 and signed George over to him for a term of 7 years. The contract specified that George would learn the trade of chimney sweeping and would be fed, clothed, and housed by his master. The contract did not specify that George would survive the apprenticeship. The contract did not need to. Roughly 1 in 200 climbing boys did not. The trade had operated in Britain since the 17th century. Coal-burning fireplaces produced thick, sticky soot that adhered to the inner walls of chimneys. Soot, if not removed, caught fire. Chimney fires burned down houses. The solution, in an age before flexible braid, was overwhelmingly male, because boys were considered more expendable. The work was done naked or in thin cotton drawers. Clothing snagged on the rough brick. The boys' elbows and knees were rubbed raw on the first day, bled for weeks, and eventually formed thick calluses that resembled tortoiseshell. Their lungs filled with soot. Most of them developed a cancer of the scrotum called chimney sweep's carcinoma, which had been first described in 1775 by the surgeon Percival Pott as the first occupational cancer ever identified in medical history. The cancer typically appeared between the ages of 15 and 20, after years of soot accumulating in the skin folds of the groin. It was almost always fatal, and the death was slow, and it was painful, and it was the price of the trade. George Brewster was 12 years old on February 12, 1875. He had been climbing chimneys for 4 years. He was small for his age because he had been deliberately underfed by his master, in keeping with the trade practice that thinner boys fit narrower flues. William Wire had taken George to Fulbourn Hospital that morning to clean the asylum's main chimney. Wire waited at the bottom. George went up. The chimney narrowed at the second floor level to a flue of approximately 9 inches by 9 inches. George had climbed through narrower spaces. He climbed into the flue, brush in one hand, scraping with his elbows and knees. About 15 feet up, the flue made a bend. George got around the bend. About 5 feet past the bend, his shoulders wedged. He could not move forward. He could not move back. He called down to William Wire that he was stuck. Wire, who was experienced, with soot in his throat. They pulled the body out through the hole Wire had made. The local coroner held an inquest the following week. The verdict was accidental death. William Wire was charged with manslaughter. The case went to the Cambridge Assizes in March of 1875. Wire was convicted and sentenced to 6 months in prison. George Brewster's death made the national newspapers. The Earl of Shaftesbury, who had been campaigning against the use of climbing boys for 50 years and had passed 5 separate acts of parliament against the practice, all of which had been ignored or evaded by the trade, used George Brewster's name in the House of Lords. He read the inquest report aloud. He described the dimensions of the flue. He described the weight of the boy. He described the half hour with the sledgehammer. He demanded a 6th act, with criminal penalties, with mandatory licensing of master sweeps, with police enforcement. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 passed Parliament on August 5, 1875, 6 months after George Brewster's death. The act required all master sweeps to obtain an annual license from the police. It required the police to revoke the license of any sweep who employed a child under 21 to climb a chimney. It made the offense punishable by imprisonment with hard labor. The act did not stop chimney sweeping. It stopped child chimney sweeping. Within 5 years, the climbing boy trade was extinct in Britain. Mechanical brushes, which had existed since 1803 but had been resisted by master sweeps as inferior, became the only legal method. George Brewster was the last documented climbing boy death in British history. There may have been others after him. There may have been boys who died in chimneys whose deaths were covered up. But on the official record, George is the last. His name is in the Hansard Parliamentary Record. His name is in the Cambridgeshire Coroner's Archive. His name is on no headstone because he was buried in a pauper's grave in Cambridge that no longer has any marker. Parliament passed the law 6 months later. George's death wrote the law. His parents received no compensation. William Wyer served 4 months of his sentence and was released. The Earl of Shaftesbury, who had fought this fight for half a century, died in 1885, 10 years after George, and was buried at Westminster Abbey. There is a statue of him in Piccadilly Circus, the famous Eros, which commemorates his work for the poor. There is no statue anywhere of George Brewster. He was 12. She walked the streets at 4 in the morning, shooting peas at bedroom windows. Her name was Mary Smith. She lived in Limehouse in the East End of London, and she practiced a profession that has now disappeared completely, but which kept the British industrial economy running for almost 150 years. She was a knocker-up. Her job was to wake people up before sunrise. Mary worked from the 1890s through the late 1940s. There were thousands of knocker-ups across Britain in those decades. Mostly women, mostly old, mostly working in industrial cities and dock neighborhoods where men needed to be at their jobs by 5 or 6 in the morning, and where alarm clocks were either too expensive or too unreliable. A knocker-up walked a regular route at the same time every morning. For each customer, she had a method. She tapped on the bedroom window with a long pole, or she rapped on the door with a stick, or, in Mary's case, she carried a peashooter and shot dried peas at the upstairs window glass until she heard the sleeper stir inside. The peashooter was Mary's signature. Most knocker-ups used poles, which were called knocker-up poles, 8 or 9 feet long, with a small bunch of wire or a soft hammer at the end. Mary had decided early in her career that a peashooter was more efficient. A pole could only reach the 2nd floor. A peashooter could reach the 3rd or 4th floor. In Limehouse, where dock workers lived in tall, narrow tenements above shops and pubs, the 3rd and 4th floors mattered. Mary's peashooter was made of brass. It was about 18 inches long. She kept it in a leather sheath on her belt. She filled her apron pocket with dried peas every evening before she went to bed. She was paid 1 penny per customer per week. A penny in 1905 was worth roughly 70 pence in 2024 currency. If a customer slept through the first volley of peas, Mary would shoot a second. If they slept through the second, she would walk on, because she had a route to keep, and she was not paid extra for stubborn sleepers. Her customers included dock workers at the West India docks, bakers at a row of bakeries on Commercial Road, factory hands at the Bryant and May Match Factory in Bow, the same factory where Sarah Chapman had walked out the gate 17 years before. Mary walked her route every morning except Sunday. She started at 3:45 in the morning. She finished at 6:15. In summer, she walked through the early dawn. In winter, she walked through pitch dark, in fog, in rain, in snow, sometimes carrying a small paraffin lantern. She walked the same streets, in the same order, in the same shoes, for 43 years. She knew every front step of every house on her route. She knew which houses had dogs that would bark, and which houses had cats that would scream when they saw her. She knew the dock workers' wives, who often opened the door to give her a cup of tea on cold mornings. She knew the names of children who had been born and grown up and moved away on her route. She had outlived 3 of her customers' husbands. The newspapers wrote about her occasionally. A reporter from the East London Observer interviewed her in 1931 when she was already in her 60s, and she told him she had never overslept her own start time once in 35 years. She said the peashooter was the only piece of equipment she had ever owned that mattered. She said her father had been a knocker-up before her, and her grandmother before him, and she did not know how the trade had started in her family, but she knew it would end with her, because nobody under 30 wanted the job anymore. She was right. The alarm clock had been killing the knocker-up trade since the 1870s, but cheap alarm clocks did not become genuinely affordable for working-class families until the late 1920s, when American mass production drove the price of a decent wind-up alarm down to about 3 shillings. By 1940, half of Mary's old customers had bought their own clocks. By 1950, almost all of them had. The men who came back from the Second World War were a different generation. They did not want to be woken up by an old woman with a peashooter. They wanted a Westclock's Big Ben on the bedside table. They wanted modernity. Mary kept walking. She walked through the Blitz. She walked through the rationing. She walked when her route had bomb craters in it and hoses missing from it. She walked when the West India docks were burning. She walked when half her customers had been killed in the air raids of 1940 and 41. She walked because the men who were still alive still needed to get up. She retired in 1972. She was 86 years old. She had been waking East London for 58 years. She gave an interview to the BBC the year she retired. She said she had walked, by her own calculation, somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 miles in her career. She said she had used roughly 2.5 million dried peas. She said the worst part of the job had not been the cold mornings. The worst part had been the silence of the streets when she walked home at 6:15, and the city did not yet know it was awake. She said it had been a lonely trade. She said it had also been the best work she could have asked for. She woke a city for 43 years. Then a battery did it for free. There is no profession of knocker-up anywhere in the United Kingdom now. There has not been one since the 1970s. The peashooter Mary Smith carried is in a small display case at the Museum of London Docklands. Her apron is folded next to it. The card reads, Mary Smith, knocker-up, Limehouse, 1886 to 1976. She used a peashooter and dried peas to wake working men of the East End. She was the last of her trade. His umbilical snapped at 300 feet. He had 8 minutes of air. He survived 30. His name is Chris Lemons. He is a saturation diver, which means he works in a profession that is currently the most dangerous legal job a healthy adult can do for money in the developed world. The saturation diving accident rate, per hours worked, is higher than commercial fishing, higher than logging, higher than oil rig roughnecking. It is one of the few remaining professions where the worker is, on a routine basis, in an environment where unassisted human survival is measured in minutes. Chris was 32 years old on September 18, 2012. He was working on a vessel called the Bibby Topaz in the North Sea, about 130 miles east of Aberdeen, Scotland. The Bibby Topaz was a dive support vessel, and Chris was part of a 3-man team performing maintenance on a subsea oil manifold at a depth of approximately 300 feet. The water temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. The visibility was almost zero. The pressure at that depth was roughly 10 times atmospheric. To work at 300 feet for hours at a time, Chris and his 2 colleagues, Dave Uwasa and Duncan Alcock, were in a state called saturation. Their bodies had been pressurized to match the depth they were working at, and they had been living in a sealed chamber on the Bibby Topaz for the past 28 days. Saturation diving works on a simple principle. Once a human body reaches equilibrium with the surrounding pressure, it can remain at depth indefinitely without further decompression risk. So instead of decompressing every day, saturation divers stay pressurized for weeks at a time, sleeping, eating, and working in a steel chamber the size of a small caravan, breathing a mixture of helium and oxygen called heliox. Their voices, on heliox, sound like cartoon characters. When the team needed to work, they transferred from the chamber on the deck of the ship into a diving bell, which was a steel sphere lowered down to the seabed by a winch. From the bell, they exited through a hatch at the bottom and worked outside, connected to the bell by a long umbilical cable. The umbilical contained their breathing gas, their hot water for the heated suits, their communication line, and their power. The umbilical was their lifeline. Without it, at 300 feet, in 4-degree water, in pitch darkness, a saturation diver had only the gas in his small bailout bottle to keep him alive. The bailout was rated for between 5 and 10 minutes, depending on exertion. On September 18, 2012, the dynamic positioning system on the Bibi Topaz failed. The dynamic positioning system, called DP, was the computer that kept the ship stationary above the worksite by automatically firing thrusters against wind and current. Without DP, the ship began to drift. The drift was slow at first, then faster. The diving bell, hanging on its winch cable from the underside of the ship, drifted with it. So did Chris Lemons, who was outside the bell working on the manifold, attached by his umbilical. The umbilical was 300 feet long. The ship drifted faster than the umbilical could pay out. At a certain point, the umbilical became taut. At another point, it caught on the metal frame of the manifold and snagged. At another point, it snapped. Chris Lemons, at 300 feet on the seabed, in pitch-black water, found himself suddenly disconnected from the diving bell. His communications were gone. His hot water was gone. His main breathing gas was gone. He had only what was on his back. He had a single emergency bailout bottle of Heliox, rated, in theory, for between 5 and 7 minutes of moderate work. He was, in reality, stranded on the bottom of the North Sea, alone, in cold that would kill an unprotected human in 15 minutes, in darkness so complete that he could not see his own hands. He climbed back onto the manifold structure to wait. He thought, by his own later account, that he had perhaps 8 minutes. He thought about his fiancée, Morag, who he was supposed to marry in less than a year. He thought about the wedding venue they had booked. He thought about the fact that nobody knew where he was because nobody could see him and nobody could hear him. He sat on the manifold and tried to slow his breathing because the slower he breathed, the longer the gas would last. On the surface, Dave Uwasa and Duncan Alcock had retreated into the bell when the umbilical snapped. They could not see Chris. They could not communicate with him. They reported the situation to the ship. The ship was now drifting in a storm and had lost its primary positioning. The bridge crew began the process of restoring DP, which was supposed to take, in best-case scenarios, between 15 and 20 minutes. 20 minutes was much longer than Chris had air for. The ship's captain, Jürgen Maurer, made a decision that probably saved Chris Lemons' life. Instead of waiting for full DP recovery, he attempted to use the remaining manual thrusters and the wind itself to drift the ship back toward Chris's last known position. It was a maneuver that should not have worked. The visibility on the surface was poor. The seabed was 130 miles offshore. The diving bell, dangling from the winch, had to be guided to within a few feet of where Chris was sitting. Inside the bell, Dave Uwasa and Duncan Alcock made a different decision. Uwasa, a 28-year-old saturation diver from Tokyo, suited up to go back out. He knew Chris was almost certainly already dead. The math said so. 8 minutes had passed, then 10, then 15. There was no atmosphere on Earth where a man held his breath at 300 feet for 15 minutes. Uwasa went anyway. He told Alcock to feed his umbilical out as fast as he could. When the bell, by some combination of luck and seamanship, drifted back over the worksite at approximately the 30-minute mark after Chris's umbilical had snapped, Dave Uwasa exited and dropped to the manifold. He found Chris Lemons sitting on the structure where he had last been seen. Chris was unconscious. His skin was blue. He had no pulse. Uwasa attached a recovery line, hauled him back to the bell, and got him through the hatch. Alcock began chest compressions inside the bell. The bell ascended. The chamber on the deck was prepared. Chris Lemons was carried, dead by every clinical standard, into the medical chamber. He was not dead. After approximately 3 minutes of CPR, Chris Lemons took a breath. He coughed. He vomited. He opened his eyes. He had survived approximately 30 minutes on a bailout bottle that was rated for less than 10. The medical explanation, which has been studied for over a decade and is still imperfectly understood, involves the extreme cold of the water, which slowed his metabolism to a fraction of normal, the high partial pressure of oxygen in his bailout gas, which loaded his blood with a reserve well above sea level saturation, and a phenomenon called the mammalian dive reflex, which redirects blood flow from the extremities to the core when a face is submerged in cold water. Chris had also, by sheer accident, been sitting still on the manifold rather than panicking, which dramatically reduced his oxygen demand. He spent 4 more days in the saturation chamber, undergoing slow decompression. He walked off the Bibi Topaz 2 weeks after the accident. He had no permanent neurological damage. He had no significant physical injury. He was checked into Aberdeen Royal Infirmary for observation and discharged within 48 hours. The medical team that examined him said that, to their knowledge, he was the only documented case of a saturation diver surviving a complete umbilical separation at depth without rescue gas resupply, and they could not explain it medically. They wrote in the report that the patient should be dead and is not. Chris went back to diving the next year. He has now been a saturation diver for more than 15 years. He still works in the North Sea. He still descends in bells. He still walks across pipelines at 300 feet in cold, black water with a single bailout bottle on his back. When asked, he has said that he loves the job, that the job is the only job he has ever wanted, and that he is not a man who is comfortable on the surface for very long. He kept the suit, the orange diving suit he was wearing on September 18, 2012, with the umbilical fitting on the back of the helmet, sat in a cardboard box in his garage in Aberdeen for more than a decade. There is a hole in the back of the helmet where the umbilical was sheared off by the manifold edge. He showed the suit to a documentary crew in 2019. He showed it to me when I met him in 2022. He said the same thing both times. He said, "I keep it, to remember I should be dead." He said, "I do this job because somebody has to do it." He said, "The rules now are better than they were in 2012. The rules now exist because of what happened to me. Every diving accident report that gets filed, every safety code that gets revised, somebody paid for that line in someone's medical record." The saturation diving fatality rate since 2012 has dropped by approximately 40%. Backup positioning systems are now mandatory on all DP-class dive support vessels. Bailout bottle capacity has been increased on most North Sea contracts from a 5-minute rating to a 15-minute rating. Chris Lemons did not die, but the rules changed because he almost did. His near-death wrote the protocols that protect every saturation diver currently working anywhere in the world. There are 6 people in this video. 5 of them are dead. Catherine Donohue glowed in her coffin in Ottawa, Illinois in 1938. Charles Stewart died of a brain full of mercury in Danbury in 1901. Sarah Chapman lived to 83, but watched 4,000 of her co-workers buried with rotted jaws. George Brewster suffocated in a Cambridge chimney at 12. Mary Smith retired in 1972 and died in obscurity, the last of her trade. Chris Lemons is alive. He is in his 40s now. He still dives the North Sea. He still wears a suit with a hole in it. 5 of these professions no longer exist. Nobody paints radium dials. Nobody dips matches in white phosphorus. Nobody sends children up chimneys. Nobody walks through Limehouse at 4 in the morning with a peashooter. Mercury hat making is illegal in every developed country on Earth. The trades died because the people in them died. And finally, after enough deaths, after enough public outcry, after enough trials and inquests and parliamentary debates, the law changed. Saturation diving is the only one of these jobs that is still hiring. It is still hiring this morning. It is hiring because the alternative, sending no human to the bottom of the North Sea at all, is not yet possible. Robots cannot do all the work. Until they can, men like Chris Lemons go down. every safety law in this video was written in someone's bones. The radiation badge clipped to the collar of every hospital worker traces back to Catherine. The ventilation in every modern factory traces back to Charles. The maternity leave law traces back to Sarah. The child labor protections trace back to George. The disappearance of certain trades altogether, knocker-ups, hat felters, dial painters, climbing boys, is the way some industries finally end. Not by reform, by extinction, by somebody somewhere finally drawing a line that says no more children up chimneys, no more lip pointing the brush, no more mercury in the felt. Chris Lemons keeps the hole in his suit to remember he should be dead. The rest of us should remember the same thing every time we clock into a job that did not kill us. Somebody made sure of that. Somebody whose name we may never know paid the bill. I am Blackwell. The next file in the archive is about a different kind of work. It is about the people who died not for wages, but for a photograph of themselves. They are called the selfie deaths, and there are now more than 500 documented cases. We will meet 7 of them. The first one fell from a cliff in Yosemite in 2018, holding her phone. She got the shot. She did not get home. The archive is open. I will see you next time.